I'm Sahar Zand, the host of Dirty Work, a podcast series for Sky News about the world's largest police organisation, Interpol. Interpol's red notices are essentially a digital wanted person poster meant to help the police forces around the world to catch some of the world's most dangerous fugitive criminals. But our investigation has revealed how red notices are also vulnerable to abuse by those in power, like authoritarian regimes, to make life hell for the people they don't like. In our second episode, I take you to Interpol's headquarters in Lyon to meet the man in charge, the General Secretary of Interpol, Jürgen Stuck. He's adamant that Interpol is working as it should and that he has fixed the problems. But I encourage you to hear the stories of the people we've spoken to who found themselves on the wrong end of an Interpol red notice, to see for yourself if you agree with Jürgen Stuck. You can now subscribe to Dirty Work wherever you get your podcasts from.
Welcome to The Daily. I'm Niall Paterson, and in this edition, we're returning to the conflict in Ukraine. With President Zelensky's counteroffensive fully underway, it would seem somewhat counterintuitive to be talking of peace, but that is exactly what, get this, one Vladimir Putin has been doing.
In general, the African initiative, in my opinion, can be the basis of some processes aimed at the search for peace.
Now, he's been responding to a 10-point plan submitted by 7 African nations to both Kiev and Moscow back in June. Meanwhile, 2 drones have hit the Russian capital, and Zelensky is talking of taking the fight to Putin.
Ukraine is getting stronger. Gradually, the war is returning to the territory of Russia.
With months of the fighting season to go, what price peace? Plenty for us to discuss then. To that end, in a moment, we will be speaking to Dr. Alex Vines. He's director of the Africa programme at Chatham House. But we'll start with Sean Bell, Sky's military analyst. Sean, just in terms of that counter-offensive, how is it shaping up? Is it having the desired effect? I mean, are the Russians feeling the pressure from the Ukrainians?
It's a very topical question, isn't it? I think it's worth just setting some context here. President Zelensky announced he was going to be conducting a counteroffensive because he needed the weapons from the West. Those weapons arrived, tanks, but some of them needed training burden on them, so the offensive was delayed. That gave Russia a chance to build lots of its defensive lines, and it didn't take a rocket science to work out where those attacks were likely to take place. And
so was that a mistake then by Zelensky?
History will judge whether it was a mistake or not. There was the harsh reality. He desperately needed Western weapons, to, particularly the tanks, to make any sort of breakthrough. Now, although it's difficult, there wasn't a start line and a whistle blowing, but it looks like about the 4th, 5th of June the offensive started. So we're in a sort of 8th week of that offensive. And I think part of it is the expectation. If you remember up in September, I think it was, in Kharkiv, the Ukrainians did a lightning quick counteroffensive and liberated 12,000 square kilometres of land in a matter of days. There's almost the air of expectation from the West that they do the same in the South. But the harsh reality with layered defences of trenches, of dragon's teeth and of minefields, which are particularly difficult, Zelensky could clear those with infantry.
Dragon's teeth?
Yeah, these are the sort of pyramid structures. They're about 1 metre tall, they're about concrete, and they just play havoc with tanks because they slow tanks down particularly. So all of that means that the counteroffensive, Zelensky shouldn't be rushed with this, because otherwise he'll end up taking huge casualties. They are doing lots of probing attacks. I think 2 key points, one of which is Ukraine is actually only using 9th Corps so far, which it's not their primary warfighting capability. 10th Corps is the primary warfighting. It's got the main warfighter, it's got the main tanks, etc. It looks likely they're going to commit that when they do a breakthrough. In other words, when the floodgates open and they'll be able to make it through. The second point, though, I think is if Zelensky doesn't make significant progress in the coming few weeks, he probably couldn't have been better prepared with money, with equipment, with training and support. And therefore, I think that could lead to a very worrying stalemate. And that will be very worrying for the West because West support might start to waver.
What is the current state of the Russian forces that they are targeting, however? One has to assume that the departure of Prigozhin and the Wagner group has affected their effectiveness.
I think, again, there's 2 parts to that. There's the Russian soldier in his trench pointing his gun at the enemy. He's got some barricade forces behind him. In other words, Russian forces where their guns trained on Russian soldiers. If they turn round, they'll be shot. So they have no choice. So probably the front line, the physical defences are pretty robust. The soldiers at the front line are fairly robust. But as soon as you get through that, now you're into the unknowns. And what with Prigozhin's march, Putin will want to bolster his internal security in Russia. He's not using the Wagner group anymore in Ukraine because he's panicking about that. And that's the group that delivered the only battlefield success in recent times. And President Putin is worried about which commanders he can trust and which he can't. So as soon as you make some sort of breakthrough, you now rely on the strength of depth of Russia. That's where I think most people will see the fragility of the Russian forces.
I suppose, though, and you mentioned stalemate, and the longer that this conflict goes on, the longer that there are these kind of knock-on effects. And you think, first and foremost, I think of, the grain issue down in the south. It's still a problem getting assets out of this country. And that is something that Zelenskyy will want to get sorted.
He will, but I think, again, it's trying to set in context what's the main issue here. Now, grain for Africa is a really significant issue. But for Russia, as the leading exporter of grain, it also exports a lot of oil and gas, and it's probably more interested in that from a revenue perspective. So what Putin is doing is weaponizing grain, and how he's doing that is reduce the global supply, increase the price that people get, and of course, for you and I, that might add a few pennies to the cost of a loaf of bread. Frankly, we won't really notice the difference. But for African nations, the poorest in the world, where poverty, that is where you're going to see the biggest effect.
Seems an appropriate point to bring in Dr. Alex Vines, Director of the Africa Programme at Chatham House. Alex, that is one of the things I think that I found most curious about this ongoing conflict, is that it is bringing in so many disparate parts of the world. And Africa, as we've just been mentioning there, the grain issue will be weighing heavily on the minds of various leaders.
The African Peace Initiative that went to both Kyiv and St. Petersburg last month was all about grain and a little bit about trying to prepare the way for a negotiated settlement between Ukraine and Russia. You're absolutely right. Already wheat prices are up by 10%. That doesn't really impact us in the UK, for example, but it certainly does in Africa. Late last year even, I was in a very remote area of northern Mozambique, watching the demobilization of former guerrilla fighters that had been in the bush for 30 years. I asked one of them what was their biggest fear, and it was the cost of living and inflation on staples. And then they, to my surprise, blamed a distant war in Europe, referring to the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
We'll talk in greater depth about the peace plan in just a second. But how does Africa view this ongoing conflict, so far away from them, but clearly having an effect?
So they see this as a European war, but they see that it has economic consequences on them. So that's why Africans are looking to try and find some sort of settlement over this conflict. It's interesting that there's just been a Russia-Africa summit in St. Petersburg that finished at the end of last week. Only 17 African heads of state and government actually attended that summit, compared with the first version of it, which was in 2019, where 43 heads of government attended. And so Africans are ambivalent about what's happening in Ukraine, but there was still 49 African countries represented in St. Petersburg. So Africa realizes that Russia is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. It is an important country, and so they will engage in it, although they're not particularly impressed by the conflict that's taking place in Ukraine. At the end of the day, one of the key pillars for Africa's continental body, the African Union, is territorial integrity. Because if you start unpicking international boundaries in Africa, which have all come from the imperial colonial period, then the whole of the African continent starts to fragment. So that's a really important first principle for most African states.
So let's talk then about the potential for Africa to serve, and obviously I'm speaking in very amorphous terms, but this 10-point African plan possibly bringing us closer to at least some kind of peace in that part of the world. Just walk us through the plan itself. What is exactly on the table?
A leaked version of it suggested is 10 points. And it includes the withdrawal of nuclear weapons from Belarus back to Russian territory, a cessation of hostilities, confidence-building measures. This was drawn together by a group of African presidents that visited Kyiv and St. Petersburg last month, led by President Ramaphosa of South Africa.
I believe that we've got a declaration that can take our relationship between Africa and Russia forward.
But also supported by the president of Congo-Brazzaville, Sassou Nguesso, and also involved the chair of the African Union, the continental body, President Azumandi, who's also the president of the Comoros. They were all in St. Petersburg for the Africa-Russia summit, and they were all very vocal about the need for peace. And it does seem as if Mr. Putin has recognized that he has to make some sort of recognition of strength of view from Africa. And so the announcement that Mr. Putin was considering the Africa Peace Initiative and also the Chinese version of it.
Sean.
There's lots of politics behind this. And I was interested in Alex's view as well, that whilst we look at this from a generic perspective, it's also clear with Sudan, Niger, there's a lot of instability in Africa at the moment. Mm-hmm. And the Wagner Group and other mercenary outfits are becoming increasingly influential. Russian flags have been seen waving. And therefore, what role is Russia playing in that instability, particularly financial, which is less altruistic than potentially the headlines suggest?
Africans are very circumspect about mercenary forces. And so, yes, Wagner is involved in 4 African countries currently, Libya, Mali, Central African Republic, and Sudan. It was notable at the summit that's just finished in St. Petersburg that the junta leader for Burkina Faso was very prominent there and being lauded by Mr. Putin. So it's clearly a case that Russia's trying to get entry into Burkina Faso. Regarding Niger, well, it's very contradictory. So the foreign minister of Russia, Mr. Lavrov, has condemned the Niger coup, saying that there needs to be a rapid return to constitutional order. Meanwhile, on the fringes of the St. Petersburg summit, Mr. Prigozhin was very visible. And he on Telegram, sent out a message saying that the coup in Niger was a step against colonialism, imperialism, or neocolonialism, should I say, and that the Wagner Group was ready to assist the new military junta in Niamey, the capital of Niger, if they needed support. So again, the contradictions of Russia are even playing out in kind of public diplomacy about response to a coup.
Alex, I mean, of course, it's not just Russia that has been very active in Africa over the past few years. China as well. I mean, from a Chinese perspective, would they prefer to see the African-sponsored peace initiative actually come to fruition? Or does it not rather serve their purposes in Africa if the ongoing conflict continues?
The Chinese have invested so heavily in the African continent that they wouldn't want to see contagion. I mean, they have serious oil assets, for example, production assets in Niger, and the Chinese Foreign Ministry has actually issued a very strong statement about the need to return to constitutional rule there. Actually, what I'm seeing is that China is benefiting from Russia's troubles, particularly in the area of defense. And I think this is the problem for Russia, that actually it's losing momentum in the African continent. Yes, Wagner's in 4 countries, but its footprint is shrinking. It's losing market share. And I think it must be worrying for Mr. Putin that he could only attract 17 heads of state and government to St. Petersburg last week. I mean, just for a comparison, the UK-Africa Leaders Summit in Washington, D.C. in December last year attracted 49 heads of government and state from Africa. That's telling you something. It
certainly is. I mean, Sean, let's just get your view, though, on these. Well, in fact, there are 2 peace plans. China, of course, came up with their 12-point peace plan, which called for a ceasefire but didn't condemn the invasion, didn't oblige Russia to withdraw from occupied territories. Compare and contrast that with the African plan, as we understand it, getting rid of your tactical nukes from Belarus, the Russian troop pullback, also the idea that Vladimir Putin would not be facing an ICC, an International Criminal Court arrest warrant. Now, I mean, on both of those, we're kind of asking whether or not these would be amenable to the Russians, but I'm just wondering if either of them is amenable to the Ukrainians.
I think we're living in a bit of a parallel universe here. I think the whole issue of peace proposals is a bit of a sideshow. You have to remember that, exactly as Alex said, Russia's power is diminishing on the global stage. It desperately needs to maintain its allies in Africa. It absolutely needs to maintain China on side, because it's the only main export for oil and gas, in addition, obviously, to India as well. So there's a little bit of politics going around, and nodding his head sagely, saying that there's some really interesting proposals on the table. The harsh reality of this is that wars are only actually stopped when one side wins, and there's no sign that either side is on the verge of winning, or both sides get to a stalemate and they need to negotiate. And at the moment, with Ukraine on the front foot, there's no way President Zelenskyy is going to give up territory. And Russia at the moment, I suspect, will, although there's probably an increasing appetite for Putin, because things are not going his way at the moment. There's a lot of discussion about whether his power base in Russia is being eroded, that actually he might not last the year out.
Well, just on that then, we were discussing this before we came into the studio, Sean. The idea that once again we have seen drone attacks on Moscow itself is, as you are describing it to me, it plays into all of that, doesn't it?
Absolutely it does, because tactically a drone attack in the middle of Moscow hasn't done a significant amount of damage. But just imagine that going off in central London. Just imagine the shockwaves that would emanate through the community of London if that was to happen. And part of this is just demonstrating that Russia's economy has been going downhill. Yes, the elite in Moscow, even the oligarchs, are starting to feel the pain now. You've got Yevgeny Prigozhin marching on Moscow and seemed to get quite close before he was turned round.
Far too close for comfort.
No,
Putin,
exactly. So Putin won't know where to turn. And I think all of these attacks, the West does not want to see Ukraine use Western weapons to attack Moscow. But without going to a history lesson, World War II, end of Pearl Harbor, America wanted to strike Japan, couldn't do it, did the Doolittle raid. They stripped out bombers, took them as close as they could, one-way missions, delivered an attack on Tokyo. Did it do any material damage? No. Did it remind Tokyo and Japan they were in a war? Absolutely it did. And when history looked back, that was a turning point in the war. So that's one of the reasons that Zelenskyy will be really keen to maintain pressure on Moscow.
Indeed. But history also tells us that peace can sometimes be achieved in the most unlikely of situations. We'll be examining the possibility in just a moment. So we have not one but two peace initiatives on the table, one from China, which does appear to have gone away, and that from Africa. So let us return to Dr. Alex Vines, who leads the Africa programme at Chatham House. Alex, do you think that this African initiative can actually work? I mean, I suppose a lot of that depends on whether or not these African nations actually believe that Ukraine can win the war.
Well, look at the counting at the UN General Assembly and the five votes that have taken place. 19 African countries have backed Ukraine, but the majority, so overall, African states abstained or did not show up on 52% of the occasions. The majority of Africans don't see this as something that they're going to come out and support, but they will abstain. Only 2 African countries actually come out in support of Russia. Yeah, that's Eritrea and Mali. So most Africans actually that I talk to believe that the result will be a hurting stalemate. They describe this as a marathon and that Russia is a much bigger state with a lot more people, and that eventually Mr. Zelenskyy is going to have to accept that he's not going to have full territorial integrity and that he will need a compromise. I was in Maputo a few months ago when the foreign minister of Ukraine was touring, and the Ukrainians have, over the first year, very much neglected Africa. They've only just woken up to that 25% of the UN is clustered in Africa amongst its 55 African countries that are on the continent. And the Russians have actually been much more effective in terms of propaganda. So I think we're going to see increased African diplomacy, especially led by countries like South Africa, offering an off-ramp, a way out for Mr. Putin. There's sympathy for Ukraine, but at the end of the day, there's pragmatism on the African continent. There isn't a lot of belief that Mr. Zelenskyy can fully prevail across all Ukrainian territory, particularly the Crimea Peninsula.
And Sean, what is your view on that? Not setting you two against each other here, but I suppose you might be coming from slightly different positions. I mean, victory for Putin is stalemate, isn't it? Victory for Putin is just carrying on with the situation as it is at the moment, or at least he can describe it to his people as that. For Zelenskyy, it's a bit more difficult to see whether or not he can sell to his people, this part of our country is lost forever, but the conflict is over as a victory.
Yeah, this is definitely a conversation that you need a bottle of wine on the table and a couple of hours to do it credit.
I'm virtual, no wine here.
Next time, chaps. Next time.
But the short answer is that neither side. Winning is a concept that doesn't really resonate in this conflict. Both sides are going to lose. The question is, how does it get drawn to an end? President Putin was expecting to take the whole of Ukraine. That's clearly not going to happen. If you subscribe to the view he's trying to build a buffer between East and West, then the Donbass and Crimea would provide him that. And if he lost the land bridge, Zelenskyy would get back a lot of the land. At least that would potentially be the bare bones of a negotiation. But as you said, Zelenskyy, it's on him. The trouble is he's not the only stakeholder in this. The West is providing such a huge amount of support. Without that, he would struggle. So I think we're in for an interesting rest of the summer and autumn.
But that was just going to be my final question to you. I mean, if a peace initiative is going to come, it's probably not going to come during the fighting season.
Most analysts believe that it won't be until the winter time, when it doesn't stop the fighting, but it does restrict it to the hardened roads, and it's a lot more difficult to do. By that stage, I think most Western leaders will be taking a deep breath, looking at what the prospects are. The American elections elections, presidential elections happen next year. It doesn't mean there's going to be a change, but there potentially could be a change. And in context, America provides 10 times the aid, 10 times the military support of anybody else. So it is important, however much we don't want to acknowledge that.
Chaps, I will make sure that I have the wine ready for our next conversation. But for now, Dr. Alex Vines, Sean Bell, lovely to have you on the podcast. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
And that is your lot from the Daily for today. We'll be back again, same time tomorrow. See you then.